I'm Jerusha Sukhvir-Rath and you're watching News 24 Live. Now I'm joined in studio by Gary Palmer. He's the CEO of Paragon Lending Solutions. He's going to speak to us about credit in South Africa. Gary, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, traditionally, South Africans have really only been able to borrow from the 4 big banks in the country, but you believe that that's changing. Talk to us about that.
Well, it has changed, I think, since 2008. Pre-2008, you really only needed to go to the big 4 banks, maybe a few other banks like the RMBs and the Investex of the world. But then when the credit crisis hit in 2008, 2009, there was a freeze on lending. So, people needed to look for alternative solutions. A lot of smaller banks have, come on the market since then. We talk about smaller banks like Mercantile, Bidvest, Bank of Athens and the like. But what we've seen has been quite fascinating actually since 2008, 2009, which follows the international trends. You've seen an emergence of smaller banks. We've also seen a lot of asset managers coming into the markets. And what I mean by asset managers, the Sanlams, the Future Growth, the Old Mutuals, where a lot of property players never used to look to the Sanlams of the world to lend their money. But that's really become very large in terms of bigger transactions. And you've also seen a lot of non-bank lenders coming into the market. And what I mean by that is, I'll say, ex-bankers who've been in the banking environment for many years suddenly have managed to raise a pool of money and come into the market and lend. Our barriers to entry are relatively low in the lending space. And actually, there's been a big emergence of non-bank lenders, I suppose, like ourselves. And that's been quite interesting. So, everyone has found certain niches in the lending space where historically the big banks used to offer everything.
And of course, there are micro-lending companies that can lend you 5,000 Rand, when usually that would be really, really difficult to access. Yeah. But we know by speaking to a lot of our News 24 users, when they've gotten themselves into a situation where they've borrowed a small amount of money from a micro-lender, they often after the fact discover that this isn't an accredited institution, or the money that they're expected to pay back is far beyond the norm. So what advice do you have to News 24 viewers who are wanting to borrow a small amount of money but are not sure the best way to go about doing it?
Okay, so the micro-lending world is not a world that I'm part of. We lend money more to smaller businesses and big property investors, but I do understand it. You've always had micro-lenders in the market, particularly unregulated. The term loan shark, I think, comes to mind for probably many of your listeners. And what we saw, surprisingly, is that the smaller loans, banks actually got into this space many years ago, because after the recession, and especially with the implementation of a lot of the new regulations, which was Basel III, and which also followed international trends, the banks needed to look for, I suppose, new channels of where they can earn, quite high interest. And what happened there was they started focusing on the unsecured lending market. So in the past, you had private companies and big companies, in that space, and then you now all of a sudden had all the banks coming in and offering personal loans, offering overdrafts and credit cards and the like, and then the space became almost crazy. Another bubble, not so long ago, about 2-3 years ago. So I saw the writing on the wall, because the minute the banks started, climbing into this space, plus you had all the other non-bank lenders, the actual economies were awash with money, and that was fueling the economy to a point where a lot of the retailers were doing unbelievably well because people had access to credit. And then you started seeing cracks maybe about 1.5 years ago. African Bank was the big one, and a few other lenders started seeing an increase in bad debts. So now the banks have pulled back dramatically on that, but there are still other lenders in the space that are offering the micro loans. Naturally, what happened is that even with the National Credit Act that came in, there were too many people that had sort of too much exposure in this space, getting big overdraft facilities, unsecured loans where they really could ill afford them. So now they're faced with a debt trap. So what's happened now, I think you've seen an emergence of these sort of debt counselors and trying to help them through that situation. But I think the most important thing is just be careful who you're borrowing money from, because a lot of the terms and conditions in fine print and small print, and a lot of people lend money and they can't afford to pay it back, so it becomes very, very difficult. So now that the banks have pulled back on that space as well, I think people need to budget. They need to, don't borrow money unnecessarily. If you are going to borrow money, don't borrow money, on food, on food products or anything like that, and borrow money, for a home, or borrow money where it can actually help you produce income as opposed to, I suppose, consumables. So, and also be careful who you're borrowing from.
Let's speak a little bit more about the space that you work in, and that's perhaps loaning money to small businesses in South Africa. We know that during our finance minister's speech, he certainly put a lot of emphasis on the importance of small to medium enterprises in the country. If you're starting out and you're a first-time business owner and you have these options available to you, again, how do you choose the right lending solution? Is it always good to start with the banks? What do you do?
I think what has to happen here, and everyone blames government for certain things, but government has to step in to introduce new lending products to small and medium-sized businesses. The reality is in South Africa is that we don't reward entrepreneurs or self-employed people at all, as opposed to Australia, America, the UK, where a lot of the banks prefer to lend to self-employed people as opposed to salaried people. It's completely the opposite in South Africa. If you're a small business with limited track record, even if you've got 3 years financial statements, the banks really regard you as a higher risk than if you are a property owner or if you're a salaried individual. So we've got a big problem in South Africa in terms of funding small businesses. Because it does come with inherent risks. So there needs to be other channels where small businesses can go to, to secure funding. There are other products in the market. For example, what small businesses, can look for is, for example, if small businesses are providing products to big corporates, what they can do is they can go to people who can invoice their discount the invoices, as an example, which will allow them to get some cash flow to grow their business. If, for example, they need to buy property, they can go to a niche player that focuses on property. So as far as we are concerned in terms of Paragon, what we found quite important in this market is that we have got our lending criteria. Normally it's property backed. We lend money to people to buy it, to really allow their business to grow. Some of them to buy it other partners, some of them to buy property. But what we've seen is a massive amount of calls that we're receiving for people who don't know where to go. So some deals I look at and I say, well, this belongs at a bank, but they don't really know how to package them, so we do it on their behalf. Some, if they're a property developer, they've only been using one bank for many, many years, and they don't really know what other products are out there. They didn't know that there are other smaller banks. They didn't know that there are non-bank lenders or other credit funds or institutions. So they come to us and we sort their funding. Either Paragon can lend them the money, but if it doesn't fit in our criteria, we certainly know where to go. So initially it started off quite small with smaller loans, but we've been originating funding to the big institutions now in the hundreds of millions of rands. So it's become quite evident to me that there's a degree of education that needs to be put in terms of where do small businesses, even big businesses, property players, what's out there, and they come to players like us to try and assist them.
Gary, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.